Okay, and without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker for today. That's Svante Nordin, who is Professor Emeritus in the History of Ideas at Lund University and was chair in the year 1970. And if you can talk in the microphone, because that's what
Okay.
records the sound.
Do you hear me? No? Yes? You do? Well. Okay. When I was invited to contribute to this jubilee, I realized with some trepidation, I must say, that half a century has passed since I was acting chairman for the Philosophical Society. Half a century. And I also realized that half a century before that, before my time as acting chairman, the society was founded, and people in the society could listen to the famous lecture by Oswald Spengler on the decline and fall of the West. So that's the time span of this society. You know, Carl-Henning Wikmark's last novel, Meet You in Our Next Dream, Vi ses i nästa dröm, is about that celebrated occasion in 1923 when Spengler visited Lund. The hero in that novel goes back in his dream to that date and listen to what Spengler has to say. I'm going to talk about the 50 years ago, the early 1970s. I studied philosophy at the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and my PhD exam was in 1978. So that's my time. After that, I changed my subject to history of ideas. So I'm really talking about some 40, 50 years ago. And that time was a time of transition for philosophy in Lund. My supervisor, Søren Halldén, became professor of theoretical philosophy in 1964. And his predecessor, Gunnar Aspelin, had a very different take on philosophy and on what philosophy should be. In Gunnar Aspelin's time, philosophy was very much history of philosophy. He was a historian of ideas, really. Interested in, for example, in Hegel, in Marx, and in John Locke and other classical philosophers. Søren Halldén, on the other hand, was mostly engaged in logic of decision-making, logic of preference, also logic of probability, and logic of evidence, and things like that. So they were very, very different. And in fact, most of Gunnar Aspelin's students left philosophy when Søren Halldén became professor, because they didn't suit in. One of those were Sven-Erik Lidman, who later on became a professor of history of ideas. So Søren Halldén brought with him the new analytical philosophy. You could say that he introduced analytical philosophy to Lund, at least in theoretical philosophy. In practical philosophy, the professor then was Manfred Moritz. He was mentioned before. He was a German Jew escaping from Hitler in the 1930s. He was a specialist in Kant's philosophy of Kant, but later on he was very much influenced by the Uppsala philosophy of Axel Hegerström, the kind of philosophy that denied the existence of objective values. His idea was that ethical propositions and ethical sentences were really meaningless, more or less meaningless. And this value nihilism, this very skeptical way of looking at values was interesting, of course, but actually it left practical philosophers very little to do. He somehow destroyed the subject. And in fact, I believe nobody took a PhD for Manfred Moritz. After him came Göran Hermerien, and Göran Hermerien, he's not here today, but he's still with us. He had an interest in aesthetics and analytical aesthetics. So he was the person that I had most discussions with. That was my field of interest too. So you might say that the new kind of philosophy in Lund at that time was analytical philosophy, more or less. Our discussions at the philosophical societies were in Swedish, but there were frequent English-speaking lecturers and guest professors and things like that. You should write your dissertation in English, but very much of the philosophical discussion at that time was in the Swedish language, as it had been very much from the beginning. But the connection to German philosophy, which you could follow in the protocols from the 20s and 30s, disappeared more or less in my time in the 60s and in the 70s. Peter is going to tell you later on how philosophers were dressed at that time. But I suppose he won't say very much about ladies' fashion, because there were no ladies present among the Lundensian philosophers at the time. The only female philosopher I can remember from that time was Ingrid Pettersson in practical philosophy. She had she was teaching practical philosophy. I don't think she took the PhD until much later. In theoretical philosophy, I cannot remember any female graduate student. So that's interesting in the way that it separated philosophy from history, from literary history, from history of ideas. It was a very, very exclusively male subject at that time. What did we discuss? Well, all the well-known perennial philosophical questions, of course. I don't remember very much, but one thing I remember, I could take that as an example. The concept of objectivity was discussed several times. Göran Hermerien wrote a book on objectivity. Lars Bergström wrote another book on objectivity. Why did we discuss objectivity? I think it was because the concept was very much discussed at the time. The late 60s and early 70s was the time of the 68 movement, the left-wing movement, and left-wing people became very influential in the news media and in the newspapers. And they were always accused of lack of objectivity, that they were very much concerned with events and with what happened in the Vietnam War and things like that. And people tended to accuse them of being not very objective. So the very concept of objectivity was very much discussed. One philosopher at the time who wrote another book, a third book about objectivity, was Erik Ryding. Some of you will remember Erik Ryding. He wrote a very interesting book called How to Cheat Without Lying. How to Cheat Without Lying. And there he gave a key to the problem of objectivity. I didn't agree with him at the time. I debated with him at the sessions of the Philosophical Society, and I was very critical. Nowadays, I think he was entirely right, and that I was wrong. So I like to say something about his ideas. What's the problem of objectivity in for example, in news or in research? Well, there are fake news very much discussed at the present, but I don't think the fake news is the really important problem, and certainly not the philosophically most interesting problem. Instead, there is another thing. Imagine, for example, that we have a war between two different nations, and that the newspapers and the radio and television publish a lot about war crimes or atrocities committed by one of the sides in this war, and that they publish nothing at all. There's no news at all about the war crimes and atrocities from the other side in the same war. In what situation would we be then? That was Erik Ryding's question. Well, the reporting would be one-sided, certainly, but Ryding's point was that it would also be misleading. It would suggest, it would be assumed that all that was reported was really true and well known and evident. But it would at the same time be misleading. News media wouldn't be lying, but they would be cheating, because everybody who listened to the media or read what was said in the newspapers would assume that all war crimes and all atrocities were committed by only one of the warfaring nations, and that would be wrong. So Ryding's point was that there could be certain semantic rules or understandings or legitimate inferences which could lead a reader or a listener or a viewer to make false assumptions, to draw the false conclusions, and that would be a kind of cheating. And he thought that kind of cheating was the most important source of lacking objectivity. Nowadays, I think he was quite right in that his analysis were very interesting. I recommend you this book, Att luras utan att ljuga, to cheat without lying. That's just one example of things that were discussed at the Philosophical Society at that time. Now, what I'm saying might suggest that our discussions were very boring and trivial and uninteresting. But no. On the contrary, those were the days. Those were the days when philosophical problems were immensely important. They were immensely important, and they could be solved within a year or two, and very probably in Lund. After the formal discussions, all this went on in Kungshuset, the king's house. You know that brick building in Lundagård, which from the late 16th century, which in the 17th century was the first building of Lund University, and where philosophy was studied and taught and discussed during more than 300 years. So that was the place of the discussions of the Philosophical Society at that time. After the formal discussions, you could go upstairs and have a piece of bread and a piece of cheese and a glass of wine. If you did that, you could solve the philosophical problems even more rapidly. We did. But out of modesty, we left some of those problems to future generations, to you. In fact, you and I and all of you could collaborate a bit later on solving the remaining philosophical problems. That would be a good idea. I look forward to discussing them with you in our next dream. Thank you.